Hey, and welcome to this session of Excel. Today we're going to look at Vlookup and index match. So what Vlookup and index match do is that they're able to look up things in a table for you and return that. So it's basically a way to look up things in a table. That's what Vlookup does. Index match can be used in the same way, and because it does it in two components, it's a bit more flexible, and you can use it for to do a slight more diversity of tasks. So for that reason, it's good to know about both of them. It's good to be able to use both of them, and sometimes if you want to go into the details, index match can help you out. So index match is using two functions, index and match, and we'll see that in a second. So here I have a table. We have orders. So these are all orders coming in. So we have an order ID or something like that. This is the first 10 orders, just a way of knowing what the ID are. And then here's what they've ordered. This is just called ID here. One might want to call this order ID or order number, something like that. And ID would be just what somebody has ordered. So if it's a restaurant, what meal? In this case, if it's a goods store, it'd be what goods. So we could have item ID, for example. The amount, how many they ordered, 2, 1, 3, 10, and so on. And then we might want to know the names, the types, the price, the revenue. So we might just get this from our system, and we might need to know what these things are, know what the price is, and if we know what the price is, we can figure out the revenue and thus make calculations, how much did we make and so on. So how do we find this out? Well, if we have, so this could be our database that we're building, and here could be our sort of our table or where we're looking things up. And here we have the name. So based on their item ID, so we can just call it item ID here, we have some categorizations. We have the name, so this is the Big Blaster, Rubik's Cube, the Bell Jar, the Tartar Step, and Risk. What they are, these two are toys, these two are books, and this is a game. And then we have the price. Let's take it in euros, for example, 20 euros, 10, 15, 12, 25. Okay, so how would we do this? Well, if we were to do it manually, we'd see, okay, what this is just the order, when they ordered or who ordered. So we don't care about that. This is how many they ordered. It is the item ID we care about. So if this is item ID 1, we'd see that this is this one, right? So the name would be the Big Blaster, and we'd type that in, Big Blaster. As you can tell, this is a very time-consuming task. We don't want to do it like that. We don't want to go in and copy, paste neither. This is just takes too much time. We want Excel to do this for us. Now imagine you could do this. It wouldn't take long for this tiny database, but if we have hundreds and thousands of rows, we need to be more efficient than that. So we can use Vlookup for that. So Vlookup, it's one of two functions. It has the other one being HLOOKUP. The V stands for vertical, H stands for horizontal. Vlookup is much more commonly used because of the way databases are formatted. It basically does this. It does what we just did for us. It looks up something, in this case the item ID, goes to where we have our table, finds what they're supposed to return, in this case the name, and then it'll put it in here. So Big Blaster. That's what we wanted to do, and it does that quite well. So we see here, if we open up the function box, we have 3 obligatory values to put in, and then one optional one. The first 3 ones, we have a lookup value. What are we looking up in our table? Well, we're going to look up the item ID in our table. So we refer to that. And this we want to keep dynamic because in the next row, it's going to be a new item ID to look up. So this is usually a dynamic reference. The table array, where we're going to look this up. So we need to find that, and that's here. And so we get this table exclamation mark. That's because that's the name of this sheet is called table. So we get table exclamation mark. That's where our table is. But where in this sheet? Well, here. So we add it in here. We don't need to add obviously the first row with the head. With the headers for the columns. So you do that. If we're going to look up in the same table, and that's almost always the case, that is this table that we refer to, we can lock this, right? So I'm going to lock it here by adding these dollar signs that make so it's always going to be this table. And that's a common mistake if you're trying to do VLOOKUP or index match and something's wrong. It's probably because you didn't lock the table. So instead it's a dynamic, you're going to look in different places. No, you're not. You're going to look in the same table most likely, so make sure to lock it. Column index number, that's where we find our answer. And once we click on this, we see we jump back. And then you might say, okay, wait, I want to go in here again, and I want to see where do I find this? So it's this one. No, that's not what they want here. And if we read the description, we see, is the column number in the table array, in this table that we defined here, from which the matching value should be returned. Where do we find our answer? So what are we looking up? We're looking up the item ID number, right? And we looked that up here, and we saw in our first case we had 1. So we say here, look up this C5, that's here, this item ID number, 1. That's what we look up. We go to the table, and here's our table. And where do we find it? We find it there. But that's not what we came looking for. That's what we came looking with. We had that 1. We didn't need to go to the table to find the 1. We need to find, what do we need? Well, in this column, we need the name. So that's what we're looking for. We're looking for the name, Big Blaster. So in order to get that, how do we return that? Well, we say what column it is in. Well, it's in column D. No, we return what column it is in the table that we specified, which was from C to F. It was this area, right? So because we specified this area, what column is this? Well, this is the second column. We start from the left. That means this is the first column, and then the second, third, fourth. But how, so we write in 2 there. That's where we get our names in the second column. But how does the VLOOKUP function know to look up the item ID in column 1? And we didn't specify that. It might seem intuitive to us, but we didn't actually tell it to look up here. Well, that's the nature of the VLOOKUP. It always looks up in column 1. So it says it looks for value in the leftmost column of a table. That's the first column if we're counting from the left. So we don't need to specify that, but that means a table needs to be like that. The table needs to be that the lookup value is to the left. So that can cause problems if this is not in column D, but in column B, we need to change things around. But otherwise, it's okay. And here, we're just saying, are we looking up the exact value or a different one? If we write false, we're looking up the exact value. If we write true, we're looking up an approximate value. In these kind of cases where we're looking up a specific value like this, then we always write false. It's the one we want. We don't want anything else, so we write false. And we get a nice preview. It says Big Blaster. Oh, that looks good. So, and now because we've locked the table, we can roll this down, and we see we get 1 was the Big Blaster. 5 is Risk. Is that true? Yes, 5 is Risk. 3 is the Bell Jar. Is that true? 3 is the Bell Jar, yes. 2 is Rubrik's Cube. 2 is Rubrik's Cube. And 4 is the Tartar Step. That is true. So we see that it does the job for us nicely. And when we did 1, all we need to do is double click on this little green box to copy and paste it all the way down to the end of our column. Why is this? Because it's next to each other, right? So because we have this, it is right next to this this column where the data ends on row 14. If we double click on this, it will copy it down to the end of row 14. And that's very handy if it's not to the end of row 14, but to the end of row 100 and 1014. That means we do it in a second. Here for type, we want to make sure, again, column ID. So what did I do here? I just copied this over. And we need to, why? Because most of the things are the same. We're just changing a couple of things. And so what do we see what happens when I copy this over? This copies over. If it's always the item ID, which is always in column C, I can make that slightly nicer by locking this, not completely, but just to the column. I'm always going to be looking at column C. So put a $sign before my C. This, not a $sign here before the 5. That keeps it dynamic, means I can roll it down and it will be C8 now, but that means I can put it 1 over and oops, pressed mistake, instead of F2. But means I can copy it and paste it to the right without it leaving this column. Now the second issue here, we say big blaster, big blaster. What do we want to return here? We want to return the type and the price. If we look here, we see that the type is in column E. What column is that? Well, if we look at our table, this is column 1, column 2, that means this is column 3, and this is column 4. So I would change this to column 3, and I would change this to column 4. And then I can take it down, and here we get the results. And we see these are numbers. I had aligned them to the right, but if we don't, then we see that they can align all of this to the right if we want. I don't know what looks nicer. And what then would the revenue be? Well, it would be the amount ordered multiplied by the price. That's the revenue. So there we go. Again, we can do this in one go if we want by just changing the revenue here and just taking the Vlookup. We'll get the price and multiply that by the amount. So we can, again, we don't want to forget that any function that does something, we can then use that output as a new input. So we just use that to multiply by this. We can use it all in one column. That is fine. But if that's you know, a bit too complex, if we're not sure whether we're getting the right thing, we can just make sure we do it in 2 columns. That's always fine. Although it might take up some more space. So we know there's the trade-off.